May 1945. The spring heat shimmered across the flat plains of northern Texas as a convoy of olive-drab trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Huntsville. Inside the covered trucks, 37 Japanese prisoners of war sat in silence, their faces betraying nothing of the thoughts that churned beneath their stoic expressions. Most were veterans of brutal campaigns across the Pacific, men who had survived Guadalcanal, Saipan, and the Philippines. They had endured hunger, disease, and the chaos of defeat. They believed they understood suffering. They were about to discover how wrong they could be. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these men could not have imagined was that their greatest transformation would come not from punishment or hardship, but from an unexpected gift that would challenge everything they had been taught about honor, surrender, and the value of life itself. The trucks came to a halt near a series of weathered wooden barracks at the edge of the compound. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Harrison, the camp commandant, stood waiting with his arms crossed. He was a lean man in his early 50s, a career cavalry officer who had spent most of his military life with horses rather than modern mechanized warfare. The irony was not lost on him. While the world had moved to tanks and aircraft, he found himself managing a facility far from any battlefield, dealing with defeated men who spoke a language he did not understand. As the prisoners filed out of the trucks, blinking in the bright Texas sunlight, Harrison studied their faces. Most were young, perhaps in their early 20s, though a few showed the weathered features of career soldiers. They moved with military precision despite their circumstances, forming orderly lines without being told. Their uniforms were a patchwork of American-issued clothing stamped with the letters PW on the backs. Through an interpreter, a second-generation Japanese-American named Robert Tanaka, Harrison addressed the assembled prisoners. Tanaka had volunteered for military service despite his own family being interned in California, believing that loyalty must be proven through action. His presence was a curiosity to the Japanese prisoners, many of whom viewed him with suspicion, a man who looked like them but had chosen the enemy's side. Harrison's words, filtered through Tanaka's translation, were straightforward. The prisoners would be assigned work details. This was not punishment, he explained, but a requirement under the Geneva Convention. They would be treated fairly, fed adequately, and housed properly. What he did not mention yet was the nature of the work they would be doing. The following morning, Sergeant James O'Connor, a burly Irishman from Boston who served as the camp's labor coordinator, led the prisoners toward the western edge of the compound. O'Connor had grown up in the city and knew nothing about ranching or horses. His assignment to this particular camp had been a bureaucratic accident, but he had learned quickly. As they approached a series of corrals and stables, some of the prisoners began to exchange glances. Among them was Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto, their former infantryman, who had been captured on Luzon after his unit had been cut off and surrounded for 3 weeks. Yamamoto was 24 years old, though he looked older. He had joined the military with dreams of honor and glory, beliefs that had been systematically dismantled by the realities of war. When he first saw the horses, his stomach tightened with dread. In the culture he had grown up in, certain tasks carried profound implications about status and worth. The handling of animals, particularly the cleaning of stables, was work reserved for the lowest classes. Yamamoto had been taught that to surrender was the ultimate dishonor, but he had done so when the alternative was watching his remaining men starve to death. Now, he believed, his captors were making that dishonor complete by assigning him to work befitting an outcast. Standing beside Yamamoto was Private First Class Hiroshi Nakamura, who had served as a medic before his capture. Nakamura was shorter and slighter than most of the other prisoners, with gentle eyes that seemed perpetually sad. He had witnessed more death than most combat soldiers, trying desperately to save wounded men with inadequate supplies and no hope of evacuation. When he looked at the horses, he felt something unexpected, a flicker of curiosity mixed with his apprehension. The third man, whose story would become central to what followed, was Sergeant Kenji Sato, the senior-ranking prisoner among the group. Sato was 31, a career soldier who had served in China before the Pacific War began. He had seen combat in ways that haunted his dreams, but he maintained the rigid discipline expected of his rank. When he understood what work they were being assigned, his jaw tightened, but he gave no other sign of his thoughts. O'Connor, unaware of the cultural storm he was about to navigate, gestured toward the stables and corrals. Through Tanaka, he explained that the camp maintained approximately 70 horses. These animals had been part of a cavalry training program that had been largely discontinued as the military shifted to mechanized units. Now they served various purposes around the sprawling camp complex: transportation, recreation for officers, and connection to a military tradition that was rapidly becoming obsolete. The prisoners would be responsible for feeding the horses, cleaning the stables, maintaining the corrals, and exercising the animals. Those with riding experience would be trained further. Those without would learn. O'Connor spoke matter-of-factly, having given similar orientations to dozens of work details over the past year. What he could not see was the silent communication passing between the prisoners. Yamamoto's face had gone carefully blank, a mask he had perfected during interrogations. Nakamura looked down at his feet. Sato stood rigidly at attention, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the corrals. That first week was torture of a kind none of the prisoners had anticipated. Not physical torture. The work itself was demanding, but no more so than military training had been. The torture was psychological, spiritual. Every morning they rose before dawn, ate a breakfast of oatmeal and coffee that was better than anything they had eaten in the final months of the war, and then marched to the stables. There, surrounded by the smell of hay and manure, they performed tasks that confirmed their deepest fears about what surrender had meant. Yamamoto worked in silence, his movements mechanical. He had been assigned to mucking out stalls, a task that required him to shovel soiled bedding into wheelbarrows and spread fresh straw. The work was endless. As soon as one stall was clean, there was another waiting. His hands, which had once held a rifle with pride, now gripped a pitchfork that seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. At night, lying in his bunk, Yamamoto stared at the ceiling and thought about his family back in Japan. His father had been so proud when he enlisted. What would he think now? The shame felt like a physical weight on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Nakamura had been assigned to work with the feed and water systems. He measured out grain, filled water troughs, and made sure each horse received its proper ration. The precision required reminded him of his medical work, the same attention to detail, the same awareness that carelessness could cause suffering. But whereas he had once measured morphine and sulfur drugs, he now measured oats and hay. The disconnect between his training and his current task felt like an insult. Sato, because of his rank and age, had been given a supervisory role among the prisoners. He was responsible for organizing the work details, ensuring discipline, and reporting to O'Connor each day. This position forced him to actively participate in what he viewed as their collective humiliation. Each morning when he assembled the men and marched them to the stables, he felt the weight of their judgment. They followed his orders because military discipline demanded it, but he could see the question in their eyes. How could he cooperate with this degradation? But then something unexpected began to happen. It started with Nakamura. On his 5th day working in the stables, he was filling a water trough when one of the horses, a large chestnut mare named Copper, approached him. The horse had been watching him for several minutes, and now she extended her neck, her soft nose nearly touching his shoulder. Nakamura froze, unsure what to do. The horse made a gentle sound, somewhere between a snort and a sigh. Without thinking, Nakamura reached out and touched the mare's neck. Her coat was warm and smooth under his hand. She leaned into his touch, her large dark eye regarding him with what seemed like curiosity, rather than fear or aggression. For the first time since his capture, perhaps for the first time since the war began, Nakamura felt something shift inside him. This creature asked nothing of him except this simple contact. She did not care about honor or shame, victory or defeat. She was simply alive, and for a moment so was he. That evening, Nakamura did something unusual. He sought out one of the American soldiers who worked regularly with the horses, a young private named Danny Reeves from Montana. Through gestures and the few English words Nakamura had picked up, he asked questions about the mare. Reeves, surprised but pleased by the interest, answered enthusiastically. He had grown up on a ranch and loved horses, with the uncomplicated affection of someone who had known them all his life. Over the following days, Reeves became an unlikely teacher. He showed Nakamura how to brush the horses properly, how to check their hooves for stones, how to recognize signs of illness or discomfort. Tanaka often served as translator during these sessions, and he found himself fascinated by the transformation he witnessed. Nakamura, who had been withdrawn and silent, became animated when discussing the horses. He asked detailed questions about their care, their diet, their behavior. Word of this began to spread among the prisoners. Some viewed Nakamura's growing interest as collaboration, a betrayal of their collective resistance to this assignment. Others, watching from a distance, felt their own curiosity stirring. Yamamoto was among the skeptics. He continued his work with grim determination, refusing to see the horses as anything other than the instruments of his humiliation. But he could not help noticing small details. The way a young colt followed its mother around the corral, its movements all awkward enthusiasm. The gentle patience of an old gelding, who stood still as a statue while being groomed, his eyes half closed in contentment. The explosive energy of a stallion who ran the fence line each morning, his mane flying, his powerful muscles rippling under his glossy coat. One afternoon, Yamamoto was moving a wheelbarrow full of soiled bedding when he lost his grip on uneven ground. The wheelbarrow tipped, spilling its contents across the stable floor. He cursed in Japanese, a rare break in his stoic demeanor. As he bent to clean up the mess, he felt a presence beside him. One of the horses, a gray mare named Misty, had approached. She stood watching him, her ears forward with interest. For reasons he did not fully understand, Yamamoto found himself speaking to her in Japanese. He told her that this work was beneath him, that he should never have surrendered, that everything he had believed about himself had been proven false. The horse listened with apparent attention, occasionally shifting her weight or flicking an ear. She did not judge, she did not mock, she simply stood with him while he worked. When Yamamoto finished cleaning up the spill, he found himself reaching out to touch the mare's neck, just as he had seen Nakamura do with Copper. Her coat was soft under his calloused hand. She leaned into his touch, and something tight inside his chest loosened just slightly. The transformation accelerated after Sergeant Sato had his own encounter with the horses. As the ranking prisoner, Sato had maintained the greatest distance, refusing to engage with the animals beyond what was absolutely necessary for his supervisory duties. But one morning, while checking on a work detail, he witnessed something that changed his perspective. A young stallion named Thunder had become agitated, possibly spooked by a snake or a sudden noise. The horse was rearing and kicking in his corral, 1,000 pounds of panicked muscle and speed. Private Reeves was trying to calm him, but Thunder was beyond reason. Without thinking, Sato vaulted the corral fence and approached the horse from the side, speaking in low, steady Japanese. His voice carried the same tone of command he had used with soldiers, firm but not harsh, conveying authority without threat. Thunder's ears swiveled toward the sound. The horse was still agitated, still dangerous, but something in Sato's voice caught his attention. Sato continued speaking, slowly moving closer. He spoke about discipline, about control, about the importance of remaining calm even when the world seemed chaotic. He was speaking to the horse, but he was also speaking to himself. Gradually, Thunder's movements slowed. His breathing remained rapid, but the wild edge of panic began to fade. When Sato was close enough, he placed his hand on the stallion's neck, maintaining that steady stream of calm words. Thunder shuddered, his muscles rippling, but he did not pull away. Private Reeves, watching from the fence, was stunned. Later, he would tell O'Connor that he had never seen anything like it. The sergeant had approached a spooked stallion with the confidence of a master horseman, despite having no formal training. O'Connor, hearing this report, began to wonder if there was more to these prisoners than he had assumed. That evening, Sato gathered the prisoners in their barracks. Through the informal network that existed among them, word had spread about what had happened with Thunder. The men looked at their sergeant with new respect, but also with questions. Sato stood before them, his posture as rigid as always, but his words were different from anything he had said before. He told them that he had been wrong. He had viewed their assignment to the stables as punishment, as an attempt to humiliate them by giving them work fit only for the lowest castes. But he had come to realize something important. The Americans did not see this work the way he did. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had been a cavalry officer. The American soldiers who worked with the horses treated them with respect, even affection. Private Reeves, who came from a ranching family, spoke of his father's horses with the same reverence some men reserved for sacred objects. In American culture, horsemanship was not degrading. It was a skill, sometimes even an art. The prisoners had brought their own cultural assumptions to this situation, Sato explained. They had seen humiliation where none was intended. They had felt shame for work that their captors viewed as valuable and important. This did not erase the fact of their surrender, nor did it make their defeat any easier to bear. But perhaps, Sato suggested, they could choose to see this situation differently. Perhaps they could choose to learn. The shift that followed was not universal or immediate. Some prisoners remained resistant, clinging to their shame as the last shred of their military identity. But others, encouraged by Sato's words and Nakamura's example, began to approach the work with new eyes. Yamamoto found himself volunteering to work with the young horses, the yearlings and 2-year-olds who were just beginning their training. These animals were full of energy and uncertainty, not yet understanding what was expected of them. Working with them required patience, consistency, and a willingness to communicate across the barrier of species. Yamamoto discovered that he was good at this. His natural quietness, which he had always seen as a weakness, became an asset. The young horses responded to his calm presence. Private First Class Nakamura began studying horse medicine under the supervision of the camp veterinarian, Captain William Chen, a third-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco. Chen had initially been skeptical about teaching a Japanese prisoner, given the atrocities committed by the military in China, but he was also a man who believed in the healing power of working with animals, and he saw genuine interest in Nakamura's eyes. Through Tanaka's translation, Chen taught Nakamura to recognize signs of colic, to treat minor injuries, to understand the delicate balance of a horse's health. Nakamura absorbed this knowledge with the same intensity he had once brought to his medical studies. Here was a way to use his training to heal, rather than simply to patch together broken men so they could return to battle. The relationship between the prisoners and their captors began to evolve in unexpected ways. Private Reeves started teaching riding techniques to several of the prisoners who showed aptitude. Language barriers led to elaborate pantomimes and demonstrations, which often ended in laughter when misunderstandings occurred. Yamamoto found himself actually smiling one afternoon when his attempt to mount a horse ended with him sitting in the dirt, while the horse looked back at him with what seemed like amusement. O'Connor, watching these transformations, reported back to Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. The commandant decided to visit the stables himself to observe. What he saw confirmed O'Connor's reports. The prisoners worked with focus and care. More importantly, they worked with something that looked like contentment. Harrison made a decision that would prove controversial among his staff. He authorized the creation of a small ranch program where the most skilled prisoners could work more independently with the horses. This included supervised trail rides on the camp property, advanced training sessions, and even breeding program responsibilities. Some of Harrison's officers objected. These were enemy soldiers, they argued. They should not be given privileges or opportunities that seemed to reward their service to the other side. But Harrison had spent enough time in the military to understand something important about human nature. Idle prisoners became resentful and difficult. Engaged prisoners, given meaningful work and treated with basic dignity, caused far fewer problems. The horse program was not about reward. It was about practical management and perhaps about recognizing shared humanity. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese prisoners at Camp Huntsville had become an integral part of the horse operation. They maintained the stables with pride, treating them better than many American facilities Harrison had seen. They worked with the horses with a level of dedication that impressed even the most experienced horsemen on staff. Then, in August, everything changed. Word spread through the camp about explosions in 2 Japanese cities, weapons of unimaginable power. Days later, the prisoners learned that their homeland had surrendered. The war was over. The reaction among the prisoners was complex, relief mixed with despair. The fighting had ended, which meant no more death, no more destruction. But their country had been defeated utterly, and they were thousands of miles from home with no clear path back. The shame of surrender, which had been gradually transforming into something else, threatened to return with renewed force. Sergeant Sato gathered the prisoners again. This time, he spoke about what they had learned from the horses. These animals, he said, lived in the present moment. They did not dwell on past defeats or worry about uncertain futures. They responded to how they were treated now, in this moment. When treated with respect and care, they gave trust and cooperation. When treated with kindness, they returned affection. Perhaps, Sato suggested, there was a lesson in this for men as well. The process of repatriation began slowly. It would be months before transportation could be arranged to return prisoners to Japan. During this waiting period, the work with the horses continued. For many of the prisoners, it had become more than just assigned labor. It had become a source of identity, purpose, and even joy. Yamamoto wrote letters home to his family, describing his work with the horses. He did not know if the letters would ever arrive, given the chaos in Japan, but he wrote them anyway. He told his father about learning to ride, about the young horses he had helped to train. He wrote about discovering that there could be honor in work he had initially viewed as degrading. He tried to explain how horses had taught him that surrender was not the end of all value, that a man could be defeated and still find ways to contribute, to learn, to grow. Nakamura spent his final weeks at the camp compiling a medical manual on horse care, working with Captain Chen to create a document that combined Western veterinary practices with his own observations. The project was conducted entirely in his spare time, driven by his desire to leave something of value behind. Chen was moved by this effort and later had the manual translated and published through a small agricultural press. It would become a minor reference work used by several ranching operations in Texas through the 1950s. The day of departure arrived in November 1945. The prisoners assembled for the final time, their few possessions packed. They wore civilian clothes provided by the Red Cross, their prisoner uniforms consigned to history. Before they boarded the trucks that would take them to a ship bound for Japan, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison did something unprecedented. He assembled the entire horse staff, American soldiers and Japanese prisoners together, at the main corral. Through Tanaka, who had become far more than just an interpreter over these months, Harrison spoke to the departing prisoners. He thanked them for their work, which he described as exceptional. He told them that they had helped maintain an important piece of military tradition during a time when such traditions were being swept away by mechanization and modernity. Then Harrison brought out 3 horses, Copper, Misty, and Thunder, the horses who had become particularly bonded with Nakamura, Yamamoto, and Sato, respectively. He allowed each man a few final minutes with their horse, a private farewell that Harrison felt was earned through months of dedicated care. Nakamura stood with Copper, his hand on her neck, his eyes wet with tears he did not bother to hide. He whispered to her in Japanese, thanking her for teaching him that healing could take many forms, that caring for life was never wasted effort regardless of the species. Yamamoto rested his forehead against Misty's neck, breathing in the familiar smell of her coat. He told her that she had helped him understand that dignity could be found in unexpected places, that sometimes what seemed like punishment was actually a gift. Sato stroked Thunder's mane, his usual rigid posture softening. He spoke to the stallion about discipline and control, but also about the importance of recognizing when to let go of old beliefs that no longer served. Thunder nuzzled his shoulder, and Sato found himself smiling, something the other prisoners had rarely seen. Private Reeves stood nearby, ostensibly to handle the horses, but really to give the men space for their goodbyes. He had become friends with these prisoners, despite the language barrier, despite the fact that they had been enemies. He had learned that shared love for animals could bridge divides that politics and war had created. As the prisoners climbed into the trucks, many of them looked back at the corrals one final time. The horses stood at the fence, some of them calling out with the distinctive whinny that the prisoners had learned to recognize as greeting or farewell. It was a sound they would carry in their memories for the rest of their lives. The journey back to Japan was long and complicated. The prisoners traveled by truck to Houston, then by ship across the Pacific. During the voyage, they had time to reflect on their experiences. Many of them discussed what they would do when they returned home. Japan was devastated, its cities in ruins, its economy shattered. Rebuilding would require decades of effort. Yamamoto decided that he would seek work related to animals when he returned. Perhaps there would be a need for people who understood livestock, who could help rebuild agricultural systems. The skills he had learned in Texas might be valuable in ways he had not anticipated. Nakamura planned to return to medicine if possible, but he carried with him a new understanding of healing that went beyond treating injuries and illness. He had learned that sometimes the act of caring for another living being could heal the caretaker as much as the one receiving care. Sato knew that he would face difficult questions about his time as a prisoner. In post-war Japan, returning prisoners often faced stigma and suspicion. But he had made peace with his choices. He had learned that leadership sometimes meant guiding others to see familiar situations in new ways, to find value where they expected only shame. The ship arrived in Yokohama in December 1945. The prisoners disembarked into a country that was barely recognizable. American occupation forces were everywhere. Traditional structures of authority had collapsed. The emperor, once considered divine, had declared his own humanity. Everything had changed, but the memories of their time in Texas remained constant. As the years passed and Japan began its remarkable recovery, the former prisoners of Camp Huntsville scattered across the country. They rarely spoke publicly about their time as prisoners. It remained a sensitive topic in a society still processing defeat. But among themselves, in occasional reunions or chance meetings, they would reminisce about the horses. Yamamoto did indeed find work with animals, eventually managing a small agricultural cooperative that bred horses for recreational riding. The skills he had learned in Texas served him well. He never forgot the feeling of connection he had experienced with Misty, the way she had accepted him without judgment. Nakamura returned to medical practice, specializing in rehabilitation medicine. He often reflected on how his work with horses had taught him about the healing process, that recovery was not just about repairing physical damage, but about rebuilding purpose and dignity. Sato became a teacher, working with young people who had grown up during the occupation and were trying to understand their place in a transformed society. He taught them about discipline and tradition, but also about adaptation and the importance of questioning inherited assumptions. In 1967, a small group of the former prisoners organized a reunion. 7 of them managed to attend, including Yamamoto, Nakamura, and Sato. They met in Tokyo and spent an evening sharing stories. The conversation inevitably turned to the horses of Camp Huntsville. Nakamura revealed that he had maintained correspondence with Captain Chen over the years. The veterinarian had sent him updates about the camp, including the sad news that Copper had passed away in 1959 at the respectable age of 23. Learning this, Nakamura felt a genuine grief for a creature he had known for only a few months more than 20 years earlier. Yamamoto shared that he had named his own daughter Kasumi, Mist, in honor of Misty. It was a small connection to a time in his life when he had learned important lessons about humility and dignity. Sato, always the most reserved, admitted that he sometimes dreamed about thunder, about the moment when he had calmed the panicked stallion. In those dreams, he was speaking not to the horse but to his younger self, trying to calm the fear and shame that had threatened to consume him. The reunion was bittersweet. These men had shared an experience that set them apart from most other veterans. They had been prisoners, which carried its own weight in Japanese society. But they had also been privileged to discover something valuable in their imprisonment, a connection to creatures who had taught them about living in the present, about finding purpose in simple work, about the possibility of dignity after defeat. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had retired from the military in 1948 and purchased a small ranch in Texas, never knew the full impact of his decision to assign those Japanese prisoners to work with horses. He had made a practical choice based on available labor and camp needs, but that choice had set in motion transformations that rippled through the lives of dozens of men, affecting their families, their careers, their understanding of themselves. The Camp Huntsville horse program was eventually discontinued as the prisoner population was repatriated and the military completed its shift away from cavalry traditions. The stables were torn down in the early 1950s. But for a brief window of time in a prisoner of war camp in Texas, men who had been enemies learned shared lessons from creatures who knew nothing of war or politics, only of the immediate reality of care and connection. The historical irony is profound. These Japanese prisoners had expected punishment. They received instead an opportunity to engage with work that would transform their understanding of honor, dignity, and defeat. They had been prepared for their captors to confirm their worst beliefs about what surrender meant. Instead, they encountered men who valued horses and the skills needed to care for them, who were willing to teach enemy soldiers simply because those soldiers showed genuine interest in learning. This story is, in many ways, about the unpredictability of human connection. It is about how shared work can build bridges across cultural divides. It is about the power of animals to teach humans lessons we might not learn from each other. And it is about the transformative potential of approaching familiar situations with new perspectives. The Japanese prisoners who worked with horses at Camp Huntsville during World War II experienced something rare in the history of war. They found in their captivity not just survival, but growth. They learned that even in defeat, even in circumstances they initially viewed as humiliating, there could be discovery and purpose. The horses, in their simple way, taught lessons about presence, about responding to how one is treated rather than dwelling on past wrongs, about the value of consistent care and attention. These lessons stayed with the men for the rest of their lives, shaping how they rebuilt their careers, raised their families, and understood their place in a world that had been utterly transformed by war. What began as a work assignment they dreaded became a gift they cherished, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, unexpected sources of light can emerge. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.